You might have clicked on this video thinking I was going to talk about how ridiculous it is that Persona keeps getting spin-offs, and that the overall problem is that there are too many spin-offs and that's going to affect the development of mainline titles. However, most of the time the spin-offs are done by different teams or even different companies, so that really doesn't affect the actual development of the mainline Persona games. The thing I actually wanted to talk about was that this game came out too soon, and this one should have been developed while they were developing a definitive edition of their mainline game. And you may be curious as to why I feel that way, so I'm going to take you down memory lane first. Persona 4 received a multitude of spin-offs, these being Persona 4 Arena and its expansion Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, as well as PQ and Persona 4 Dancing All Night. While Arena was in development, Persona 4 Golden, the definitive edition of Persona 4, was also being made. This resulted in a very mild story inconsistency between Persona 4 Golden and Persona 4 Arena, which Arena addresses in its expansion Ultimax. This is due to the fact that Golden introduces one character who is not relevant in the original Persona 4. Arena's story is not exactly written with them in mind. This is fine because it barely affects the story, as I said before. And you might be thinking, oh, well, what about Persona Q? Well, Q is a little different. It takes place during the School Culture Festival of Persona 3 and Persona 4. These games take place at different times, so while Q happens, it happens in between that time period and is never acknowledged outside of it. However, you should keep in mind that since Q was developed after Persona 3 and 4, there aren't any story inconsistencies because it's contained within a game that already exists, within a storyline that already exists. So after all these spin-offs, we got the final one, Persona 4 Dancing All Night. This is the final Persona 4 spin-off, at least for now. God only knows if they'll make another one. And we got tons of remixes of songs from the Persona 4 line of games. While this is a pretty random idea for a spin-off, it kind of works. It's kind of like a final hurrah for Persona 4, as you get remixes of all of these songs with characters dancing to them. It's really just a good time. It kind of comes off as a celebration of Persona 4 and its success and its other spin-off titles. And this is probably why we hit rocky ground with Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight. So the original Persona 5 released in 2016 or 2017, depending on where you are in the world. After that, a concert happened where we got the teasers for Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight and Persona 3 Dancing in Moonlight, as well as Persona Q2. So Dancing is the first spin-off? I mean, it's a little confusing, but whatever. I mean, we'll see how it turns out, right? So 5 Dancing came out to very little fanfare. We just knew that Persona 5 Dancing could have been so much more, and you had to deal with that on top of the fact that a lot of people don't really like the remixes too much, myself included. Of course, there are some that are pretty good, but a lot of them just don't hit as hard as the originals. It just felt like Dancing shouldn't have been tossed out that early. So now we've covered why Dancing feels so weak, let's talk about Strikers. I personally really like Persona 5 Strikers. It's a continuation of the story of Persona 5, with new characters, and it expands on existing cast members. It's a lot of fun. But the problem is, which game is canon? Is Royal canon? Is Strikers canon? How does this work? In Strikers, Royal's content is never mentioned a single time. For those of you who are uneducated on this, Persona 5 came out in 2017, Persona 5 Royal came out in 2020. Royal adds an entire new arc to the game. This content is not brought up in Strikers, and this is because, in Japan, Persona 5 Strikers was developed around the same time Persona 5 Royal was. These games released roughly 5 months apart, meaning by the time we were getting Persona 5 Royal in Japan, Strikers was pretty much almost done being made. It ultimately made for a pretty awkward experience. I mean, whenever you try to talk about this game online, there's always the question of what is canon, what belongs and what doesn't. Strikers doesn't acknowledge anything that happens in Persona 5 Royal, so is Royal canon? But how could Royal not be canon when it was made by ATLUS? So is Strikers canon? But how could Strikers be canon if it doesn't mention anything in Royal? The answer is ultimately pretty simple. ATLUS will write their way around this problem. If it does wind up happening that we have another Persona 5 spin-off that adds to the story, we're probably going to get into territory where they just write around the fact that Royal was not acknowledged in Strikers. There's nothing ultimately wrong with Strikers as a game, but what happens is that it feels like this game was kind of put out a little too hastily as they were developing Royal after Persona 5's development had ended, and then they start developing Strikers around the same time, I assume, it's kind of shaky, and I don't really like the way it panned out. If Strikers had come out maybe a year after Royal had come out, they would have had time to weave in the events of Royal just a little bit. While many of the spin-offs for Persona have been well-crafted games with a lot of passion put into them, there's also that sense of why did they do this so early, or why did they do this at all? It feels like with Persona 5, they were a little more hasty on making spin-offs, and that ultimately leads to this problem of how Persona 5 Dancing and Persona 5 Strikers turned out. The overall timeline of Persona 5 and its spin-offs looks something like this. I personally think it should look like this instead, in order to encapsulate all the content. This way, everything kind of comes out after they're done developing the main game, so that all the other spin-offs can have that polish of having the full story available. Unfortunately, we do have to take what we have. Persona 5 Dancing will probably never see some kind of update or DLC to add in other characters and new remixes, but you never know. Could just be a few weeks away. But unfortunately, it seems Persona 5 Dancing will never be the culmination of all of the music of the Persona 5 games, unlike Persona 4's. Strikers will never feel as cohesive as other story spin-offs might feel, because it struggles to deal with the fact that its mainline game had a new arc added to it, and it didn't have time or the knowledge to write that into their story. What I'm trying to say here is that if you're going to do spin-offs, I hope you do them right. And it's not like any of these games are especially bad. I think underneath Persona 5 Dancing, really, there is a solid rhythm game there. I mean, it's the same as Persona 4 Dancing, which I enjoyed a lot. All of the characters have like personality to their dance moves, and it's a lot of fun. Unfortunately, it turned out the way it did. But what do you guys think? Do you think there are too many Persona 5 spin-offs? Do you feel the same way as me, where you think that they should have done them in a different order? And what order would you have them do it in? Is there a particular spin-off you'd like to see, or do you just want them to get to Persona 6 already? Whatever it may be, we'll probably find out at the Persona concert this October. I'll probably be covering a lot of ATLUS stuff this month, so if you're interested, you can subscribe to the channel, and remember to like the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.